there's always a big tension in my head whenever talking about Israel and Zionism of how much do you talk about the here and now and, the Gaza war and the last couple of months, what's happening on campus, and how much do we want to talk about the theoretical and historic roots of what's going on. And so I'm going to try to mostly stay away from what's happening now. And really the goal is, if we understand the theory and the history of all of the inherent tensions and dialectics and arguments within Zionism, then we'll be much better equipped to understanding a lot more of what's going on today. I say that's sort of the theory, and then there's, of course, the part of me that's saying, no, there's so many interesting things happening in the news. So I want to start with the only news clip that we're going to see today, and only because today was a day where actually Israeli records were broken. And the front page of any newspaper having to do with Israel today, and this will, at the end of class, we will all see how this connects to our wider tension that we're dealing with today. There were between 200 and 300,000 Haredi, mostly men, in the center of Jerusalem today, protesting against a new bill that would push them and force them to serve into the IDF. The population of Israel is fewer than 10 million Jews live in the land of Israel, so having 250,000 people come and protest is 2 to 3% of the country in terms of the Jewish population. I mean, we're talking about a massive percentage of the country here that's so fundamentally against serving in the IDF. And there's a lot of reasons why. There's a lot of social reasons. There's a lot of economic reasons. And those are, of course, at play too. But I wanted to start off with talking about what I'm going to deem the paradox of Zionism. And today's whole class is about tackling this paradox. Like all good paradoxes, there are no correct answers. There's just almost like an optical illusion where you look at Zionism and the modern state of Israel from one vantage point and you have one story, and you look at it from another vantage point and you have another story. And this paradox, I want to start by illustrating a thought experiment. And so you can, close your eyes, or you can imagine that you are transported 200 to 500 years in the past, and you are now having a conversation with your Jewish ancestors from the year 15 or 1600. So some of us were transported back to Poland, others Lithuania, others Iran, others Morocco, others, a whole variety of places in the world. And you sit down with your great, times 10 grandparents, and they're asking you, what's Jewish life like in America in the 21st century, right? Tell me about this. What's going on? And you say, well, funny you ask, in the last really 3 generations, we have a Jewish nation state. We have the land of Israel. We have a Jewish government, we have a Jewish army, we have Jewish institutions. They would immediately drop to their knees and say, oh my goodness, Mashiach has come. The Messiah is here, right? This is the redemption that we've spent thousands of years praying for. Our prayers have been answered. This is the end of time. We've entered into this apocryphal era where we're at the end of history. And then you tell them, well, it's actually interesting you say that, the Messiah hasn't come yet. Most of the Jews in the world who are still classically traditional or religious are still praying for and waiting for the Messiah. And actually, the Jewish state was mostly founded by a bunch of Jews who don't actually believe that the Messiah is going to come, right? It's mostly, of course, the first 2 generations of Zionists were more socialist, more secular. And even people today, in terms of what we think of who's in political power in Israel, it's not mostly made up of Orthodox Jews who are Messianists. It's made up of people who are using normative politics of the modern nation state. And your great-grandparents would have no idea what you were talking about. They would either, A, not believe you. They would say, you must be mistaken, right? There's actually no Israel, right? You're wrong. Or they would say, well, the Messiah has come. You just haven't realized it yet. And this thought experiment and paradox gets to the root of Zionism. And it's one of those things that once you see, it's impossible to unsee it. And I'll give a couple of illustrations. And my argument for today, every class I want to have a central argument. The argument to today is this paradox and this thought experiment is central to why, in at least the Jewish world, there's so much debate and confusion and misunderstanding around what Zionism is. It's one of those things that still today, I work with mostly undergrad students, and everybody always asks me, what is Zionism? It's confusing. It's obviously a big part of Judaism, but it seems like it's something new, and there are some people who want to completely disconnect Zionism from Judaism, and other people whose entire Jewish identity revolves around Zionism, and this is because of this paradox. Now, we're going to all of next week is about Theodor Herzl, so I'm going to give him scant introduction today because we're going to focus on his main works the second week of this class. But Theodor Herzl generally is known for being the main activator and writer for political Zionism. Zionism predates Herzl. We'll talk about that a little bit today. But Theodor Herzl, when he's thinking of how to portray Zionism to a Jewish world that's quite skeptical of this political project, and we'll talk next week why many were skeptical and why some in the Jewish community today are still a little bit skeptical, right? We all know many Jews who are generally skeptical of Israel and Zionist project. Herzl writes a book in the year 1902 that he calls Alt Neuland, right? The literal translation, Old New Land. And Herzl writes this book in 1902, and the entire book, right, it's a fictional account, right? Herzl wasn't really well known for fiction. He mostly wrote, political pamphlets, right? His original Zionist manifesto was in 1897, but Herzl, later in his life decides to write a work of fiction. And it's about a group of Jews, some traditional, some not traditional, traveling to what was then some backwater of the Ottoman Empire and engaging with all these questions of, okay, we understand the political mission of what we're trying to do with Zionism, right? Jews need political autonomy, right? That's a spark notes for what we're going to talk about next week. Jews need political autonomy because anti-Semitism is never going to dissipate, right? That's the political side. But Herzl then spends an entire work of fiction considering what is the dynamic and interaction with this new state going to be with what he calls the old traditional Jews, right? This is a real tension. It was not just a historic tension of what was called the Old Yeshuv. The Old Yeshuv were mostly ultra-Orthodox Jews, tens of thousands who actually lived in the Ottoman Empire in the land of Israel long before Zionism. But it was also a theologic tension, right? All throughout the streets in the Jewish world in the 1800s, you had some Jews talking about politics and political autonomy, and others, the more traditional Jews, actually saying, we don't want any of that. So how can this be? So Herzl calls his book Alt Neuland, Old New Land, and 7 years later, the second, I'll say Tel Aviv is the second most famous city in Israel, right? Takes a second seat to Jerusalem. They break ground on Tel Aviv. This picture in the top right is a picture of the original Chalutzim, the pioneers who went a couple miles away from Jaffa, which is a very old ancient port city, and decided we're going to build a new center, a new really metropolitan and commerce center of this land. And they're trying to think, this is the first major city that is being built by the new Zionist movement. What should we call it? And they say, well, Herzl wrote a book. His book was called The Old New Land. So what should we call it? Tel Aviv. What does tel mean in Hebrew? A tel means an ancient archaeologic site. If you go to Israel today and travel around the country, there's all these places. You can go to Tel Dan in the north. It's an archaeologic site of an old temple that existed there. And you can go to Tel Yafo, right? It's the old part of Yafo, right? So Tel is an ancient archaeologic site, again, representing something that once was, that's no longer there. It's sort of buried underground, but obviously still exists. What's Aviv? Aviv is spring, right? The name of the month, right? We call Passover Chag HaAviv because it's at the beginning of the spring season. So Tel Aviv is called the Old New. Herzl's book is called The Old New. And this gets to this paradox and tension of Zionism that I want to throw at everybody today. That Zionism paradoxically attempts to combine the oldness, Jewish tradition, our heritage from 3,000 years, and combine it with a new radical form of politics that to your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents in Lithuania or Poland or Russia or Iraq or Iran would have been wholly unfamiliar with it. And the question is, how can that be? And what is our disposition, again, as a modern Jewish community trying to deal with this tension of this old and new? And what happens when those two things come into conflict? So I want to go a little bit more, and then we'll take some questions. But the main question that anytime you're teaching a class about something, you have to ask yourself, well, where should you begin, right? How should you even frame the thing? So many people always want, I get asked probably twice a day, what is Zionism, right? Zionism has taken, quite a negative connotation. I'll give you an interesting illustrative example. I was meeting with a non-Jewish student yesterday for coffee, and she asked me, and we were talking about Israel and Zionism, and she pauses me and she said, did Zionism always mean a derogatory word? And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, Zionism now is sort of a derogatory word, right? It's a negative thing, but was that always the case? And I was so stunned because, again, in circles that I run, Zionism is just a descriptive statement of the feeling that most people have that Israel should continue to exist. And it was such an interesting moment of thinking, wow, people don't even know where to begin talking about what they don't know. It's not even that people don't know. People don't even know what they don't know, which I think is hovering under the radar. So the question is, where should we begin, or how should we frame our conversation of Zionism? And we have two opposite answers, right? We have the two Jews, three opinions. Today you're going to get, one Jew, two opinions, right? I can sit here for the next hour. I won't do it, but I can sit here for the next hour talking straight without interruption about how Zionism should be viewed as a natural step or inevitable part/goal of Jewish tradition. And we'll talk about some of the sources there for 10 minutes, right? And you'll get a sense of how I can easily do this for an hour. At the same time, I can talk for another hour, and I won't do this, about how it's obvious that Zionism is a departure or even an outright rejection of Jewish tradition. And I have sources to back it up, and I have the Jewish historic record to back it up. And the interesting thing, and again, this gets to what I'm calling the paradox of Zionism, these are both true. They're both true at the exact same time. And the fact that these are both true at the exact same time leads to the confusion that we have in the Jewish community around these questions. So we'll go on a little more. If at any point anybody has thoughts or questions, feel free to just interrupt me, and I'll take some pauses throughout. And then hopefully at the end of each one of these classes, we can have some more conversation as well. So I want to talk just, very briefly. And I told myself, I wrote out an extensive outline of how much time I want to spend on each slide, because on this slide, if I'm not careful, it can be a 30-minute slide. But I told myself I have 5 minutes to do the slide, so hopefully I'll be true to my word. But I want to talk about a little bit of what we know about Jewish history in the land of Israel. And I want to start with the year 1000 BCE with King David. And you might be asking, everyone here who is a well-trotted Bible scholar and knows the Tanakh and knows the stories of the Torah and the book of Joshua and the book of Judges and Samuel, why am I starting King David? Very simply, I want to talk about the history and theory of Zionism. And King David is the first figure or time period in Jewish history where both classical Jewish faith/tradition and modern academia overlap. And so you ask your average atheist archaeology professor who studies ancient Israel, most of them will say, yes, King David is when we start to enter into what we can at least show by historic proof probably happened. Again, archaeologists don't work in absolutes, but in the year 1000 BCE, King David unites a bunch of disparate tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel, and he sets up Jerusalem as the capital, and then his son, King Solomon, builds a massive temple in Jerusalem. Over the next 200 years, the political disposition in Israel, they end up actually splitting in the north and south, where the 10 northern tribes set up their own kingdom in the north, and Judah and most of the tribe of Levi set up their second kingdom in the south. And in the year 722, tragically, King Sancherib of the Assyrian Empire destroys the 10 northern tribes and tries attacking Judah and loses the war, but Judah becomes a vassal of ancient Assyria. Interestingly enough, I promised I wouldn't bring in modern news. This is not really modern, but they just found 3 days ago, you can open another tab and Google this, a document from this period, from the 8th century BCE. It was a tax receipt that the Assyrian Empire had sent to the tribe of Judah. The tribe of Judah essentially saying, we've paid your vassal payment for this month. We're going to be a little bit late in your payment, right? It's incredible, right? This is archaeology living under our feet. So from the year 722 to the year 586, Solomon has a temple in Jerusalem. Judah, or Jews, right? The reason why we're called Jews is because the tribe of Judah is all that's left. So it went from Judah to the people of Judah to Judeans to then shorthand, we call us Jews. In the year 586, after about 150 years of Judah being there and Jewish political autonomy, the Babylonian Empire comes in. This is King Nebuchadnezzar, and destroys Solomon's temple, ravishes Jerusalem, burns it to the ground, and exiles the Jews to Babylonia. And from the year 1000 BCE to 586, Jews had political autonomy in the land of Israel, right? This massive period of 400 years. And exactly what you would expect, this is when much of our culture and religion and politics and the way that we think about the world really was able to develop and crystallize. Now, again, I told myself the 5-minute version of history and not the 30-minute. About 70 years later, King Cyrus, the next great empire, the Persian Empire, takes over the ancient Middle East from Babylon. There's an interesting thing when you consider the geography of the Middle East, where Israel is the only main land bridge between Africa, Europe, and Asia. So if you're an ancient emperor and you want to conquer the quote-unquote known world, Israel is a crucial piece of real estate. It's right on the Mediterranean. It's the only way really to get from Africa to Europe and Asia, right? Israel's always been a prime geopolitical location. This is true during the Cold War. This is also true during the ancient Persian-Babylonian wars. So King Cyrus of Persia takes over the region from Babylon, and he invites Jews to come back and rebuild the temple, right? This is why also you get pamphlets in Israel. You know, I just saw another news report last week. You know, Trump is Cyrus, right? I don't know if anyone here has seen this. It's very interesting. Right? I won't comment that politically on that, but you have all these signs popping up in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, right? King Cyrus allows the Jews to rebuild the temple, but crucially, he leaves out political autonomy. And Jews in the Second Temple, right, they understand and feel that something is lost, right? We all are probably familiar with the famous psalm, "On the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wailed." And then at the end of that, "Jerusalem, if I forget you, let my right hand forget its job," right? We still sing that at Jewish weddings. This was a poem written by Jews after the exile of 586, when sitting on the Babylonian river, right, the rivers of Babylon, just sitting there crying because Jerusalem had been destroyed. For about 400 years, Jews were living in the land of Israel, but without political autonomy. And then, of course, everyone's favorite story, in 167 BCE, we have the Maccabean Revolt, otherwise known as the story of Hanukkah, right? A group of Jewish rebels who are pushing back against the next great empire, the Greek Seleucid Empire, and the Maccabees reclaim Jerusalem. We all know the story. And they come in and they reclaim Jewish political autonomy for about 100 years. Fast forward to the year 67 BCE, Pompey of Rome takes over. He takes down the Maccabean kingship. And then in the year 70 CE, the Roman Empire destroys the Second Temple, thus starting 2,000 years, or really 1,900 years, of Jewish exile. And not just a Jewish exile, but a Jewish deep feeling, sentimental longing for Zion, right? This is something that I think is impossible to explain to somebody about modern day Israel and Zionism that's not intimately familiar with Jewish tradition. The idea of Zion and longing to return to the land of Israel is not just somewhere in our tradition. Oh, let me flip through a book. It is everywhere in our tradition. We talk about this during every holiday. We talk about it in every single prayer service, in every great Jewish poem that's been written. We talk about this longing to get back to Zion. And this also comes with, and this is going to be part of, I think, the interesting tension that's implicit within Zionism, many famous pilgrimages. There's many stories of Jews in both the ancient period, the Talmudic period of Jews mostly living in Babylon, or the medieval period where most Jews are living either in North Africa / Spain, we call them Sephardic Jews, or Jews who are living in France and England and Germany, we call them Ashkenazi Jews, of Jews leaving everything behind to just have a chance to step in the Holy Land, right? Today it's so easy. You just buy a ticket and then hope it doesn't get canceled for one of many geopolitical reasons. But back then you had many Jews across many times in history making pilgrimages to the Holy Land. And then, of course, most importantly, and I think most interestingly for this conversation, and where we get this big tension point, this was wrapped up in Messianic hopes, right? I believe in perfect faith that the Messiah will come, right? Ani ma'amin be'emunah shalema beviat HaMashiach. Ani ma'amin, right? It became one of the main Jewish creeds of faith, that the Messiah will come. We are waiting out for Mashiach. And all we need to do is keep waiting and hoping and praying and waiting some more that the Messiah will come. There's a scene, actually. I was going to try to figure out how to show this, but I decided that it would just be too interrupting. The last scene of Fiddler on the Roof, when they're all packed up, right? For those who haven't seen Fiddler on the Roof, highly recommend it. But I usually don't like to make assumptions, but I'm going to guess most people here have seen it. But if you haven't, it's a fictional shtetl in Eastern Europe sometime in the 1800s. And this town of Anatevka has just been told by the Tsar on a whim that they all have to leave. It's some anti-Semitic decree. And there's this scene at the end, the very last scene, where all the Jews are huddled around the rabbi looking for guidance. And one of the Jews goes to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, we've been waiting for the Messiah for 2,000 years. Wouldn't this be a great time for him to come? And the rabbi says, I guess we'll have to wait someplace else, right? It's a fascinating line. And this captures one of the main Jewish sentiments of the Jewish exile, that we have faith, that we are waiting, that our job is to be as steadfast as we need in our faith, in our culture, in our tradition, to wait until God decides to bring us back to the land of Israel. Interestingly enough, in that same scene on Fiddler on the Roof, right, most of them, of course, go to America, right? We all know, the great wave of American Jewish immigration, late 1800s to 1924, about 3 million Jews come from Eastern Europe to the Americas. But a small group of what's called the first Aliyah actually end up traveling to Israel, right? I don't know if you remember the Yentl the matchmaker, when everyone's talking about which city in America they're going to. She says, I'm going to Jerusalem. And we'll get back to that next week in terms of that sentiment. So what happened during this time? Before I get there, and I'm going to paint a little bit of an intellectual history of Jewish connectivity and Jewish sentiment towards the land. Before I do that, I want to take a pause to see if anyone has comments, questions, anything like that. And also I can look at all your beautiful faces for a few seconds. But thoughts, questions, comments, and then we'll go on a little bit.
Daniel,
Yes.
Is Karen. So my question is, and maybe you're going to get to this, is the whole concept of, that it's not of anti-Zionism, of that part of where we're not, just a whole movement of anti-Zionism, and how that's supported by history and literature. That I've never seen. I've always seen what you just described, because right now there's a huge effort, to go towards, the movement against anti-Zionism. And I'm trying to figure out how what are the arguments? And Adam Lewis Klein is one of those that I've been following. And I just wanted to hear why it wouldn't be that.
Yes, 100%. Adam's great, by the way. Strongly recommend everybody follows him on social media. There's 3 different types of anti-Zionism, and this is a very upsetting bait and switch that happens to the Jewish community. Next week, we're going to talk about original anti-Zionism. Original anti-Zionism was, well reasoned, right? Historically, they were sort of proven to be incorrect by circumstance of history, but they were well reasoned. These were people who cared about the Jewish community and who just thought that they had a better program for keeping Jews safe in Europe. That was one type of what we might call liberal anti-Zionism before the state. The second was Orthodox anti-Zionism. That will kind of be implied during the rest of this class. In the last, 80 years, we have something different, which is really just anti-Semitism using Israel as the Jew among nations. Israel is now synonymous with the Jew, and that certainly has no bearing within the historic record. And when I said the bait and switch, something very frustrating happens, and we'll definitely end up touching on this next week when we talk about opposition to Herzl among the Jewish community, is there's this sense, which is, like all things that people say that, are conspiratorial or, make little sense. There's a nugget of truth, which is there always have been anti-Zionist Jews. So how can anti-Zionism be anti-Semitism? That's certainly true. There have been. Before the state of Israel was founded, especially before World War I, the majority of the Jewish community was anti-Zionist because it seemed, and we'll talk about this more in detail next week, it seemed like this crazy task, this Herculean task. Why not just stay in England or France or Russia or Belgium, and things are progressing anyway, life is getting better, let's just stay here and make it better. Why should we move to this, far away land with malaria and with no water and all of these? And so you had people who were principally against Zionism, because why divert resources when we need to invest in Jewish community here? And even more so, and we'll talk about this next week, this is the most fascinating debate about anti-Zionism, which we'll talk about next week, and anti-Semitism, is the anti-Zionist Jews of the 1800s and early 1900s actually accused the Zionists of doing the things that anti-Semites were accusing all the Jews of. In other words, Jews were saying, we can be good Germans and we can be good French people, and we are the same as you. We don't have any, grand dual loyalty. And the Zionists were saying, hey, all Jews should get on board with this nation state project. And so Jewish liberals felt, oh my God, we can't let these people be the spokesperson for Jews. We need to convince the French government that we're actually, right there with them. Again, it was very historically circumstantial. Today in 2024 on a college campus, if somebody spews venomous, lies about Israel and views that Jews have no connection to Israel and Israel is just, neo-Nazi genocide, colonial, every buzzword that we've all heard, that has nothing to do with this debate. We'll unpack that a little more next week. Dylan, go for it.
Hey, Rabbi Daniel. Um, so I was curious because especially when we talk about like the concept of like Mashiach, and it wasn't there like a pretty big pushback from the Jewish community because it was this idea of, well, Israel shouldn't exist because that's why we're waiting for Mashiach, because Mashiach's going to come and restore Israel. And so earlier this week I was talking to someone. I thought if you might shed some light on that. Was that like a true thing that happened, that there was kind of this general opposition to creating a state of Israel?
Yeah, so that's the ultra orthodox, right? So I started this class. I don't know if for anyone who came on late, I started this class by saying, the news of today was it was the largest anti-IDF protest in Israel history today. About some high estimates say 300,000 Jews, Haredi Jews, were protesting against having to be drafted to the IDF, and that's exactly what you're talking about. And we'll sort of see a little bit how this ends up coming into play with everything we're talking about today. So yes, we're going to get to any and all of those questions. I want to do a little bit more, Jewish tradition slash history here, because I think this will be illustrative. And just, if nothing else, one side of the Jewish historic connection to Israel, we always say in the Jewish community, Jews have been connected to Israel for thousands of years. But many of us don't know, like, okay, well, where is that, right? Where can I find that? Is just some vague sentiment, or is this backed by Jewish law and Jewish text, something concrete? So let's go through again, just scratching the surface of this conversation. And we'll start with the Mishnah, right? So the Mishnah, just a brief 10-second background, was a set of rabbinic works really formulated in its final form in about the year 200 CE in the land of Israel, mostly around the northern Judean hills and the Galilee. And this was the first main work the Jewish community produced after the destruction of the temple in order to help Judaism figure out how do you continue on Judaism in Irvine, California, when so much of the Torah revolves around a temple and sacrifices and everything there. And so we can all thank the Mishnah for still being able to practice Judaism in lieu of a temple. And so the Mishnah already early on comments, and this is very classic of Jewish texts, right? This is a Jewish textual tradition 101. Everybody knows that Jews are very interested in law, right? Nuances of law, right? Fine-tuning points of law. But it's interesting, Jews, and this is especially true with the Mishnah and the Talmud, use discussions of Jewish law to unearth much bigger philosophic and theologic concepts, right? You can almost think of it as, almost the opposite of other religious traditions that start with these grand abstract theologic concepts and then try to figure out how should I act in the world based off of that. Jews almost do it the other way. Jews have extensive debates about every nuanced part of the law, and then through that, you can kind of uncover wider themes. So the rabbis in their tractate about ketubot, the ketubah is, of course, a Jewish marriage contract, are trying to figure out all the different rules of marriage. And one of the things that is written into a lot of ancient ketubot is a classic case that happens to many couples. What happens if they want to live in different areas? And the rabbis earlier on say, well, if I want to live in New York and my wife wants to live in Florida, sorry, neither one of us is allowed to what they call compel the other person to. What does compel mean? If you don't move with me, then you have to pay me the value of the ketubah that we decided ahead of time, right? Standard contract stuff. But then the rabbis say everybody is able to compel their spouse to go up to the land of Israel, but none may compel their spouse to leave. So let's say we have a case of a couple who's living in Egypt. There were a lot of Jews living in Egypt in the 2nd century CE or 3rd century CE. And let's say one couple says, well, I've always wanted to live in the land of Israel, in Jerusalem. And the other couple says, I don't know, I kind of like living in, Cairo or Alexandria. The rabbis say the weight of living in Israel is so important that you're allowed to compel one spouse can compel the other. And then they say even more so with Jerusalem, right? Everyone may compel their spouse to go up to Jerusalem, but none may compel their spouse to leave. The same is true for both men and women. This is a 2nd century rabbinic text in the Mishnah. So we already see Jewish consciousness, right? They're in a post-temple, post-political autonomy world. The Roman Empire is cracking down. It was not a nice thing to be living around the land of Israel in the 2nd century CE under Roman control. The Romans were increasingly rough in terms of what they allowed and outlawing study of Torah and outlawing Jewish practices such as Sabbath observance and circumcision. But still, the rabbis are saying that the power or the import of the land of Israel for Jews and the Jewish community is so great that this is something that you can actually compel your significant other to do. 5th century Babylon, we're sort of following the Jewish history through history. Much of the Jewish community in the year 200 to 300 CE moves to Bavel, moves to Babylon, modern day Iran and Iraq. And groups of rabbis get together and spend all their time interpreting the Mishnah. And this comes up with a much larger work known as the Gemara or the Talmud. And the rabbis in the Talmud continue on this theme. And again, this is now 300 years, right? The Talmud is being codified in the 5th or 6th century BCE when many of these conversations were happening. So it had been 200 or 300 years since many of them had been to Israel. Arguably, probably none of these people ever stepped foot in the land of Israel. And here is what the rabbis sitting in modern day Iraq write. Our rabbis taught one should always live in the land of Israel, even in a town, most of whose inhabitants are idolaters, right? That's weird. We're not supposed to, if you read one thing in the Torah week after week, it's that the Torah is not too fond of idolatry. And the Torah continuously warns how easy the influence of idolatrous nations are on the Jewish community. But even so, you should always live in Israel, even if you're choosing between a town who's mostly idolater, but one should never live outside the land, even in a town most of whose inhabitants are Israelites. For whoever lives in the land of Israel may be considered to have a God, but whoever lives outside the land may be regarded as one who has no God, for it says in the Torah, to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. So the rabbis are saying this verse connects living in Canaan, living in the land of Israel, to having a God, essentially being Jewish, right? This is fascinating. The rabbis are essentially telling the community in Bavel, right, in Babylon, no one should be here right now. We should all actually be in Israel. And our entire tradition kind of points to being in this land of Israel, so much so that even if you're picking, the best town full of the greatest Jewish schools and yeshivot and, kosher restaurants here in Iraq, you should actually be doing whatever you can to actually move and live in the land of Israel. Again, historic circumstances were difficult. It was not easy for Jews at this time to even travel to Israel, right? Of course, Rome turns Christian in the 4th century, and then throughout the 4th, 5th, and 6th century, the Christian world becomes even more persecuting of Jews than the Roman Empire before. And so living in Israel at this point is a terrible decision from a social perspective. On the other hand, the Babylonians, the Zoroastrian community, which was dominant in Iran, Iraq, pre-Islam, was extremely welcoming of Jews. The rabbis actually have many stories in the Talmud about how rabbis just happened to be having conversations with Zoroastrian magi's, right? Zoroastrian priests. And, they seem friendly and things seem great. And there are no stories from the Babylonian Talmud about Jews being persecuted in Babylon. And still the rabbis are saying this. We go a little bit forward. Rashi, a Jewish exegete, 11th century France. So now we're going all over the world. We started in Israel. We're going to Babylon. Now we're in the medieval Ashkenazi period. And Rashi is interesting. I was actually just talking about Rashi on campus with students earlier today. Rashi lived during the First Crusades, right? The First Crusades happened in about 1095, 1096. And Rashi was in France during the First Crusades, which was a terrible time to be Jewish in France. If you're ever reincarnated as a Jew in historic France, do not pick the year 1096 or 1097. This was a time when full Jewish communities were being decimated, when groups of crusaders came by and would just, kill any Jew who, so much as poked his head out. Full synagogues were burnt down with groups of Jews alive. And Rashi begins his magnum opus, right? Rashi is famous for writing the most important commentary on the Torah. Jews cannot discuss any verse of the Torah without going through Rashi, right? The first question always is, what does Rashi say about this? And you can imagine Rashi sitting there and opening up his, pen and his quill and scroll, and Genesis 1:1, right? The very beginning of the Torah, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And Rashi's trying to think, okay, how should I start my commentary, right? What is important that the Jewish community knows about this verse? And there's so much there, right? You can talk about God, creation, the grandeur. What does it mean? The dichotomy of heaven and earth, the Garden of Eden, right? There's so much juicy stuff there. But here's what Rashi says. Here's how Rashi starts his famous commentary on the Torah. So first he asks a question, right? This is a very legalistic question, right? A very rabbinic question. He says, the Torah, which is the book of the law of Israel, should have commenced in Exodus. So he says, why do we even have the book of Genesis? We should have started the Torah in the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 2. Why? Because this is the first commandment given to Israel, right? In Exodus 12:2, right as the Israelites are making their exodus out of Egypt, Moses comes and tells them, hey, this month shall be unto you the first of the months, right? We're starting a new calendar. We're about to leave Egypt. We're about to be our own nation. New calendar. And that comes with a commandment, a mitzvah, that we know as Rosh Chodesh, right? Where every time there's a new month, you get together and you sanctify the new month. There are special prayers and everything like that. And so Rashi says, what is the reason then that it commences with the account of creation, right? So Rashi's question really gets to the heart of what is the purpose of the first half of the Torah? If the Torah is supposed to be about a guidebook for how to live your life, why do we have the entirety of the book of Genesis? Now imagine Rashi sitting there. The first Crusades, we don't know exactly when Rashi wrote his commentary, but Rashi lived until many years after the first Crusades, and he had just seen, almost certainly he's writing this either during or after the Crusades, he had just seen all of the holy wars between the Christian and Islamic world over Jerusalem, right? The Crusades were all about getting to Jerusalem. And Rashi sitting there, the Jewish community with zero political power or chance to have anything to do with taking over Jerusalem, writes as follows. He says, because of the thought expressed in the text in Psalms 111, God declares to God's people the strength of God's works in order that God might give them the heritage of the nations. What does that mean? Rashi says, should the people of the world say to Israel, you are robbers because you took the land by force from the 7 nations of Canaan, Israel may reply to them, all the earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be he. God created it and gave it to whom God pleased. When God willed, God gave it to them. And when God willed, God took it from them and gave it to us. Rashi is saying, there's going to be a time, right, when people are going to come to the Jewish community and going to say, Israel's not yours, right? You stole it, right? Israel's the 7 nations, or Israel is the domain of Christendom or the Islamic world. And Rashi's saying the point of Genesis, again, put aside the theology here if we don't, I'm going to guess there's a wide range of views that people have about, God and biblical literalism here and everything there. What Rashi's saying is this was already a tension in the 11th century and 12th century Jewish community in France, where if Rashi's writing this, it means that Rashi would have been on the receiving end of sentiments of people saying, the Jews don't belong in Israel, right? And Rashi's saying, no, the entire book of Genesis, if you believe that God created the world, then God chose to give Israel to the Jews, right? It's that simple, right? One more, and then we'll wrap up this portion a little bit. Judah Halevi, probably the most famous medieval writer of Israel. 12th century Spain. Spain is a very different circumstance than France. If Jews in France were going through, horrible, terrible times in the medieval period with just rampant anti-Semitism, no protection, Jews in early medieval Spain were going through what many scholars deem the golden age of Spain, right? This was a time of somewhat multicultural environment. Again, I don't want to overstate it because there's been some revisionist history here, but generally Spain was a great place to live if you were a Jew living in the 900s or 1000s. There were even times where there were Jewish generals in Spain. There was the mayor of a couple towns in Spain were Jewish. This is also when we get many of the hard hitters of Jewish philosophy, people like Maimonides and Nachmanides and many of the early Kabbalistic works. And Judah Halevi grows up in a wealthy family and becomes a foremost Jewish philosopher and rabbi. And then he spends all his time writing poems about this place called Zion that he's never been to, right? He writes two, he wrote hundreds of poems, right? Here's two famous ones. The end you'll probably recognize because in Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, right, they play off the last verse. But he's sitting there in Spain writing this incredible poem, Sion Halo Tishali, right? Zion, will you not ask after the welfare of your prisoners, right? It's a love poem to Zion, to Israel. And he's saying, hey Israel, hey Zion, hey Jerusalem, why are you not wondering where we are, right? Your prisoners, the Jews, who seek your welfare and are the remnant of your flock. From west and east and north and south, the welfare of those far and near inquire from all your sides, right? The Jews are scattered everywhere, and we're thinking about you. Why are you not coming to redeem us? And the welfare of the prisoner of hope who sheds tears like Hermon's dew and yearns for them to descend upon your mountains, crying for your suffering, I am a jackal. And when I dream of the return for your captives, I am a harp for your song. Right? So you're sitting there in Spain writing this incredible love poem to Israel, to Zion. And then, of course, the most famous one with Judah Halevi, my heart is in the east, and I am at uttermost west, right? Spain was the furthest west that any Jew lived in during Judah Halevi's lifetime, all the way on the western end of the Mediterranean. And you can imagine, the emotion behind this poem, right? How can I find savor in food? How shall it be sweet to me? How can I make good my vows, my pledges, while yet Zion lies beneath the fetter of Edom? Edom was a rabbinic shorthand for the Christian world. And I in Arabian chains, right? Like, how can we enjoy anything in life? We're in exile, right? And Judah Halevi is not saying this as a Jew who underwent lots of anti-Semitism. He actually was fairly well acquainted socially and politically, and he was wealthy. He spoke many languages. He spoke Hebrew. He spoke Greek. He spoke Arabic, right? Just like many Jews at the time. Judah Halevi led a pretty good life in Spain. He says, a light thing would it seem to me to leave all the good things of Spain, seeing how precious in my eyes to behold the dust of the desolate sanctuary, right? I'm even willing to leave all of the luxuries of Spain just to behold the dust of the desolate sanctuary in Jerusalem. Judah Halevi, at the end of his life, actually takes upon a trip. He gets on a boat. He spends a couple of months in Egypt, and he eventually makes it to the land of Israel, to Jerusalem. And we don't really know what happens at the end of his life, his sort of records and there. But Judah Halevi is an example of one of these pilgrims that actually did leave everything, that actually did decide at some point in Jewish history, it doesn't matter how great life is in the diaspora. Zion, it's all about Zion and Israel. How can we forget about that, right? Don't be tantalized to forget about that while you are sitting here in Spain. Okay. I'm going to present the flip side in a second, but I wanted to see any thoughts and questions. I saw a couple of comments in the chat, and so I'll read through that while seeing if anyone has any questions. Yeah, so Gabe asked about what about the anti-Zionism that suggests a non-religious state should exist there, a one-state solution, right? So we'll probably end up discussing that a little bit next week. That kind of hinges more on Herzl's view of why it's important that Jews have political autonomy. The opposition of, quote unquote, the Arab world who rejected Israel wasn't really connected to the religious nature of the state. And so, right, we'll unpack all that next week, but it's a great question. And then Kim asks, why do we restart the Torah or why don't we restart the Torah on Rosh Hashanah? Why do we wait until Simchat Torah? It's a very dry legalistic answer. They're, both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur have their own Torah readings. And so Simchat Torah was an additional holiday that was formed about 2,000 years ago to formally establish after the holidays. Now we are officially, ending the Torah cycle for the year before, so as not to mess with the Torah reading from the holidays. We can just ask ourselves, as long as Rosh Hashanah services are, we would not be thrilled if we then read, the end of the last chapter of the Torah of Deuteronomy, and then once you end the Torah, you always start the Torah again. So it would probably add about an hour to the service. And so, a very dry answer. All right. Any other questions about this first part, this Jewish connection? Again, this is only scratching the surface. This is, each of these could have been, headers to full books of Jewish sentiment towards the land. But I wanted to give us a little bit. We had Babylon, we had the Ashkenazi medieval community, we had the Sephardic medieval community. And these were all sentiments that great Jewish leaders and great Jewish communities felt about the land. Rhea, go for it.
Yeah, so you didn't mention about the numbers or the percentage of people in the Roman Empire, throughout the Roman Empire, that were Jews. It was a pretty significant number. And so it seems that most Jews never lived in the land of Israel. Most Jews were in Iraq, Iran, Roman Empire, Spain. So, am I misreading what I think?
No, you're totally right in terms of numbers. If we, take a snapshot of the year 600 CE or the year 1200 CE, a small percent, right? There always was Jewish continual presence in the land. I think we'll talk about that maybe in like 20-ish minutes. But it was always a very small percentage. There were a lot of reasons why it was made impractical. I mean, the most obvious reason was that Jews were always the at-risk political minority, both in the Islamic and the Christian world. And the Islamic and Christian world were spending about 1,000 years fighting over the land of Israel. I mean, you have, the Islamic world in the 7th century conquers the land of Israel from the Christian world, then that inspires the Crusades 200 years later. Then Salah al-Din, leads his empire back in the 1200s. Then there's, constant skirmishes happening, all throughout that land. And so, the land of Israel and Jerusalem in particular is constantly at war, constantly changing hands. And so it was sort of, a center of, battle. So it was in some way wildly impractical to, go to Israel and to live there. In a couple minutes, we'll see that didn't stop a lot of Jews from trying. So in about, 10 minutes, we'll talk about these Jewish attempts to actually try to do this. But the cards were stacked against them because, again, both the Christian and Islamic world, which at this point, if we take a snapshot, let's say the year 1100s, right, the year of the First Crusades, they were huge. I mean, if you just Google a map of, size of the Christian world in 1100s and size of the Muslim world in 1100. I mean, these were massive empires. They had, riches. They had, land bridges connecting their entire empires together. And what did the Jews have? The Jews were scattered around in cities in the countryside. They had no centralization, no political rights, no money. They were always a minority. So oftentimes this was a problem of communication of, there was just not any of the pieces in play to actually activate any of this, which is one of the reasons why, one of the taglines for this class is, if Jews have been thinking about Zion for thousands of years, why did it take thousands of years, right? Why not do it in the year 200? There were a couple times, by the way. The most famous or infamous, right, was the Bar Kokhba revolt, right? This is fairly earlier, but in the year 137 CE, so now we're talking 67 years after the Romans destroyed the temple, a charismatic Jewish general known as Bar Kokhba proclaimed himself a Messianic figure and amassed a Jewish army of, from what we know from historic sources, tens if not hundreds of thousands of Jewish troops, and convinced much of the Jewish world to wage an all-out battle against the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire at this time was quite strong, so he lost. And after that, Rome essentially kicked all Jews out of Jerusalem for the next couple hundred years and added to their anti-Semitism and persecution. So when Jews did try, it ended quite badly. And much of the reaction, again, we'll talk about this in a second, because this gets to the paradox that we open with. The rabbinic leadership after the Bar Kokhba revolt's reaction was, okay, we need to make sure people don't do this again. Not that we wouldn't love in our wildest dreams to have Jewish political autonomy again, but it was a disaster. So we're not going to focus on that. Let's focus on ensuring Judaism survives while holding out for hopes of returning. So we have that tension also. Added to that tension, because I think, the next slide actually kind of goes to the other side of this. Again, I'm, sort of presenting this as both sides of a debate, or not really a debate, but a tension that's at the core of Zionism, is at the same time that Jews were thinking this and thinking about Zion, we also have to understand another part of Jewish tradition, which is exile as divine punishment, which I think is equally important for understanding our tradition and where we came from. And when we start to think about whether or not Zionism is a movement of continuity or a movement of rupture, the argument for continuity is quite clear. Let's try to understand a little bit the argument of rupture. So now I'm going back, right? Rewinding the clocks back. And let's open the book of Lamentations, the book of Eicha. This is a work from the Jewish community in the 6th century BCE, written during the first Babylonian exile. And the Jewish community there is trying to do what Jews have always done when destruction happens to us, which sadly is quite often, of why did this happen, right? The whole book of Eicha literally just means why or how, right? the whole book can just be a giant question mark of let's make sense out of this destruction. I thought God likes us. Why did he allow Jerusalem to be destroyed? And the book of Lamentations, right towards the end, says as follows. The old men are gone from the gate, the young men from their music. Gone is the joy of our hearts. Our dancing has turned into mourning. The crown has fallen to our head. And then they say something very interesting. And this is going to start a multi-thousand-year Jewish legacy of saying, woe to us that we have sinned. This is our fault. This isn't the fault of the Babylonian Empire. The reason why Jerusalem was destroyed is not because Nebuchadnezzar happened to amass an army that was bigger than the Jewish archers that were sitting in the walls of Jerusalem during the war. It's because we have sinned, right? This is our punishment. God has done this to us. Because of this, our hearts are sick. Because of this, our eyes are dimmed. Because of Mount Zion, which lies desolate, jackals prowl over it. Note how Judah Halevi also uses jackals in his poem. But you, O Lord, are enthroned forever. Your throne endures throughout the ages. Why have you forgotten us, forsaken us for all time? Take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back. Renew us as days of old. For truly you have rejected us, bitterly rejected against us. Take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back. Renew our days as of old. The authors of Lamentations are saying two things. One, they're pointing inward. Again, we can discuss the ethics and morals and whether or not this is good or bad. That's beyond this class. This is about understanding the sort of thought process of Jewish tradition on this. Is they're saying, why was Jerusalem destroyed by the Babylonians? They're going to say doubly, by the way, when the Romans destroyed the second temple, is they say it was our fault. We've sinned. Clearly, God is stronger than the Babylonian Empire. We all know that, right? In the assumption of the writers of Lamentation. So of course, if Jerusalem was destroyed, it's because of us. Woe to us that we have sinned, right? And then they beg God, take us back, right? Redeem us. But it's God that has to redeem us, not us, right? The rabbis continue this theme. Let's go to the Talmud, right? We're now fast forwarding 800 years. We're in Babylon. And there's a fascinating story in Talmud tractate Brachot of Elijah the prophet talking to somebody who starts to hear voices in a series of ruins in Jerusalem, right? You can imagine, an elderly man is walking through Jerusalem and just seeing all these desolate buildings and starts hearing all these voices. And he goes to Elijah and he says, can you help me make sense of these voices that I'm hearing? And Elijah says, I hear a heavenly voice, like an echo of the roar of God. Blessed be he. He is cooing like a dove, and he's saying, woe to the children. Who is the children? The Jewish people. Due to whose sins I destroyed my house, burned my temple, and exiled them among the nations of the world. The rabbis in the Talmud are depicting God as sitting there crying because God had to kick us out, right? God just had to do it, right? We were bad enough, and God had no choice but to do this. The rabbis then encode this into liturgy. Anytime you go to synagogue on a holiday, and you open up the holiday machzor, whether it's Sukkot or Passover or Rosh Hashanah, we say in the Amidah, Mipnei chateinu galinu me'artzenu, right? Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land and banished far from our land. And then we pray to God, Father, our King, speedily reveal your glorious majesty to us. Shine forth and be exalted over us in sight of all the living. Unite our scattered people from among the nations. Gather our dispersed from the far ends of the earth. Bring us to Zion, your city with ringing song, to Jerusalem, your sanctuary, with everlasting joy. This was a major tension in Jewish thought for thousands of years, right? How do you square these two things, right? This isn't Zionism in some sense. This tension and confusion at the root of it, right? Zionism inherited this tension, but how do you go on for 2,000 years, right? It's really an incredible story, right? Jews have been a diasporic community for 2,000 years and remained fundamentally attached to a land, right? Jews continue to write and think in Hebrew, right? Their ancient land, right? That's why it wasn't that difficult to reinstate Hebrew as a normal language. It's not as if Hebrew lay dormant for 2,000 years. Anytime you opened a rabbinic work, you were reading and studying Hebrew, right? Anytime you opened the Mishnah, you were reading Hebrew. Anytime you read the Torah, you were studying Hebrew. So how do you have a community of a diasporic community that for 2,000 years is not just exiled, right? It's not as if the Jews were exiled and they all went to one area where they spent the next 2,000 years. There were multiple exiles. There was the Roman destruction. Then Jews went to Babylon. Babylon ended up being great for Jews for about 300 years until it wasn't. That's when Jews started going west. Then Spain was great for Jews until it wasn't. Then Jews started going to North Africa. That was good for Jews until it wasn't. At the same time, Ashkenazi Jews, right? In the beginning, Germany was actually a great place to be Jews in the early medieval period. Then the Crusades happened. It was an awful place. Jews in Europe started moving east. Lithuania and Poland were great to be Jewish in the 1500s until it wasn't, right? So it's not just that Jews went into exile and diaspora. It's that they went into, 20 or 30 diasporas. And this tension, right? I'm going to call this tension in Jewish thought, are longing for the land versus not forcing the end. What do I mean by forcing the end? This question that was circulating implicitly around the Jewish community, and here we get one of the most interesting ideologic debates that touches on modern Zionism. Zionism directly inherited this debate. Can Jews be activists in their own redemption, or must they wait for God? Right? This is a pre-Zionist question. This is a medieval Jewish question. This is a Talmudic Jewish question. And the Jewish community was very torn on this question. There's a lot of very interesting historic evidence that we'll look at in a second. I sent out a very long book chapter to read. I'm going to guess very few people read it, so I'll briefly summarize what was in that chapter. But the Jewish community underwent a number of ideologic revolutions and tensions around this. I want to just mention one because I think it's illustrative to understanding a little bit of the historic record here. In the 12th century in Spain, the Jewish community produced a book known as the Zohar. The Zohar is best known as being the basis for much of what we know to be Kabbalah. Kabbalah gets a lot of, interesting surface level, cultural knocks here, but let's narrow in on the Zohar just for a little bit. The Zohar is predicated on the idea that the world is broken, right? What does that mean? The Zohar is dealing with a fascinating paradox that many medieval philosophers, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, were all dealing with. The paradox is as follows. God is infinite and perfect, right? Of course, we all believe that, right? Put yourself in the mindset of a year 1000 philosopher. God is infinite and perfect. Looking around the world, our world is finite and imperfect. How can a perfect God create something imperfect? And if God is infinite, where is the room for anything that's not God, right? It's a very interesting question, right? And different religious thinkers were trying to give answer upon answer to try to figure out, maybe God's not infinite, or maybe God's not perfect. Maybe there's actually, an evil half of God, Satan or the devil or whatever. And the Zohar suggests something quite radical. The Zohar says, no. When God created the world, that was actually an act of God purposely breaking not just the world, but actually God's self. There's something in God that's broken. And who has to solve it? Well, it's humans, right? The concept of tikkun olam, which, today has been, mistranslated to mean social justice. The original concept of tikkun olam, literally to repair the world, but not, by doing, political social acts, those might be good. But tikkun olam was the original idea in Kabbalah of when God created the world, that was an act of breaking. And so we have to put the world back together. How do you do that? You do that by doing commandments, by paying attention to the Torah, by doing mitzvot, by trying to put back this world one piece at a time. It's not surprising that the Zohar, this work of talking about how to fix the world, corresponded with the surge in Jewish Messianism, right? The whole point of Kabbalah was Messianic imminence, right? And the second the Zohar was produced in about, let's say, the year 1200, just to give a concrete year, CE, again, give or take, 50 years, came with all these calculations, right? If you were in a Jewish community between the year 1200 and 1800, and you were a rabbi that was, worth their stuff, you probably engaged in some sort of messianic calculation. I'll explain what exactly the calculation was in a second, but the Jewish community at this time became obsessed with calculating when is Mashiach gonna come? It's been long enough. It's been 1,000 years. You can imagine them saying, right? We're done waiting, right? And now you have this new type of idea of Kabbalah and Tikkun Olam, and everybody feels like they are doing their part to perfect the world. And the Jewish community is sitting there saying, well, any day now, right? The Messiah must come any day now. At this time, the historic record shows every generation or every 100 years or so, there were massive waves of aliyot, right? We think that massive aliyot were not until the 1880s in Russia. No, starting in the 1200s, you have waves and waves of Jewish Olim, people who were not just going to Israel to visit, we're not just going to Israel to make a spiritual pilgrimage, who actually said, we need to go back because we need to hasten the coming of the Messiah, right? Some of these Jewish communities got to the land of Israel and actively started building a temple. Others got to the land of Israel in the 13 and 1400s and started reinstating animal sacrifices. Others got to the land of Israel and started reconvening, the ancient Jewish court known as the Sanhedrin, right? The Jewish community became wrapped up in Messianic activism to try to liberate Israel and to try to hasten the Messiah. This proliferated. This increased tenfold when the Jewish community was expelled from Spain. In 1492, the King Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, and after 700 years of Jewish tenure in Spain, the Jewish community was kicked out overnight, right? You have to convert to Christianity or leave. By the way, 2/3 of the Jews in 1492 converted to Christianity. Some of those Jews kept their secret Jewish identity. They became crypto Jews, but 1/3 left. Where did they go? Many of them went to the land of Israel. They went to Tzfat. 5 years later, Portugal kicks out their Jews. And where do many of those Jews go? Yeah, some go to North Africa, but many go to Tzfat, right? And so this begins to get a major boon, right? A major energetic increase. This idea of Messianic activism after the expulsion from Spain. And this leads until possibly the greatest Messiah, quote unquote, of the modern Jewish era, a man named Shabtai Tzvi, who after what was known as the Chmielnicki massacre in the 17th century, where just this horrible pogrom of anti-Jewish violence over the course of months killed hundreds of thousands of Jews in modern-day Ukraine, the Jewish world was absolutely broken and they were looking for a savior. And Shabtai Tzvi said, I'm the Messiah. And he brought waves of tens of thousands of Jews to Israel with him. He ended up converting to Islam when he tried to challenge the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. But wave after wave of Jewish attempt to do this occurred. Again, I can go through a list, or maybe I can just email out the list after. And this in turn, right, and this will be the last thing I say, and then I'll pause for some questions. This created a massive backlash, especially after Shabtai Tzvi, the rabbinic world, the Jewish elite said, we can't have this. If every time some guy who's charismatic decides that he's calculated when the ripe time for the end of the world is and decides, oh, it's actually in 2 years from now, and so he amasses an army of Jews, and it always ends in disaster and war and bloodshed and increasing persecution, the rabbi said, no, we're done doing this. No more overt acts of messianism. You can't, what they call, force the end. We gotta wait. Messianism is not an active thing. The Jewish community should not be actively thinking about how do you get to Israel? How do you reinstate political autonomy, the kingship, and everything? The role of traditional Jews, and again, this is before the Haskalah and the Enlightenment. Next Thursday, we'll talk about the Enlightenment. This is all in an assumption of traditionalism. The rabbis said the role of Jewish tradition is to encourage passivity, right? The same thing the rabbi says in Fiddler on the Roof. We've been waiting for so long. Should we do something about it? No. Let's wait a little bit longer, because if we do try to do something too quick, it's just going to end badly for us. And even more so, perhaps we're actually going against God, right? Perhaps God himself is actually the reason why these movements are failing, is because if God put us in exile for a reason, and we are actively trying to get groups of Jews to the land of Israel to try to set up a new society there, maybe God's actually getting even more upset and everything. So much of Jewish history, by the way, in the 15, 16, 17, and early 1800s can be explained through this. The most, I once gave a class called The Most Important Jewish Debate You've Probably Never Heard of. I'm going to guess people in here have maybe heard of it, but the Jewish world was ravaged in the 18th century. This is 100 years before the Haskalah, between two movements. One known as the Hasidic movement. Everyone's probably heard of Hasidic Jews. And the lesser known one is what was called the Mitnagid movement, right? For those who speak Hebrew, to be neged is to be against something. So you had the Hasidic movement, and then you had the anti-Hasidic movement. And these were two movements that emerged in Eastern Europe, right? Eastern Europe had the largest Jewish community in the 1700s. And the Hasidic movement was all about Mashiach and Messianism and performing mitzvot in order to bring about the Messiah, right? For anybody who's interacted with Chabad, right? That is a perfect example of Hasidic Judaism, right? You have to do mitzvot, because the more mitzvot you do, the closer we are to bring about Mashiach. The rabbinic elite at that time, known as the adversaries or the mitnagdim, led by the most famous rabbi in the world at this time, Elijah from Vilna, known as the Vilna Gaon, the genius rabbi from Gaon in Lithuania, excommunicated the founder of Hasidic Judaism, the Baal Shem Tov. He literally, excommunication was not something to be taken lightly in the Jewish community. Excommunication was essentially a social death sentence, right? Nobody can marry your children. Nobody can interact with you. Nobody can work with you. And at a time when, all Jews had was each other, it was essentially, kicking you out to the wilderness and saying, go survive alone. Of course, the excommunication never stuck because the Baal Shem Tov had already amassed enough of a following that they said, okay, well, we're going to just excommunicate you back. But this split the Jewish world. If you were around in any Ashkenazi Jewish community in the 1700s, this was the biggest fight that was happening, far surpassing everything. And it was about this issue. It was about, should we front Messianism? Should Messianism be an actively encouraged thing? Or should Jews continue to sit back, have faith, pray, keep on studying Torah, keep on encouraging, the rigid, ritual practice of Jewish law and the punctualist practice of Jewish law? What should we do? And it was only because of the Haskalah, by the way, that this debate ended, right? Once the Enlightenment began to come to Eastern Europe, and we'll talk all about the Enlightenment next week, these two sides joined forces and both became, anti-Maskilim. But this, again, for about 800 years, from the time of the Zohar and the Kabbalistic proliferation all the way to the 17 and 1800s, this was the debate in the Jewish community over all of these questions that Zionism has just inherited, right? It's not even an act of necessary consciousness. There's one or two more slides that I might do if we have time at the end, but, I'll at least wrap up, this portion, and then we can see what thoughts there are. It's not even a question of, did Zionism consciously or unconsciously, it's not as if Herzl has, diaries where he's poring over, the medieval Jewish background of, okay, well, we had this group and that group, but it's implied, the entire tension that the Jewish community went through in the 1800s and 1900s when young groups of Jews were saying, we are going to solve our own anti-Semitism problems ourselves. And many Orthodox Jews said, we don't want that. But other Orthodox Jews, most notably Rev. Abraham Isaac Kook, said, this is great. This is hastening the Messiah. And the entire Jewish world was in disarray for 50, 60 years over Zionism. What do you make of this movement? Is this a Jewish movement? Is this an anti-Jewish movement? Should Zionism be incorporated with traditional Jewish ideas? Should Zionism be a rejection of traditional Jewish ideas? What should the language of the new Jewish state be? Should it be German, as many of the original Zionist founders wanted, right? It should be a proper, upstanding language. Or does it need to be an ancient Jewish language, as other early Zionists argued, right? What should the nature, right? Should the national anthem of Israel include God in it? Should it include 2,000 years of exile, or should it just be talking about the modern roots of anti-Semitism within Europe in the early 1800s and the Jewish right to self-determination, which is a modern idea? The idea that people have a right to self-determination. Nobody knew what that meant in the year 1000 CE. So should the Declaration of Independence of Israel, which, because Israel has no constitution, oftentimes serves as a constitution, should it talk about the prophets in the Bible, or should it talk about the Holocaust? What does Israel do? It has both, right? You look at the Declaration of Independence, it talks about Isaiah, and then it talks about persecution in Europe and pogroms and the Holocaust. And so this is a tension that's right at the center of Zionism, and it's why I think so many people are confused about it, and why it's so easy oftentimes to weaponize one side of this against the other. Because a lot of times when people talk about this, they say things that are true, but then when you zoom out, you realize they're only part of the truth, right? Any definitive statement, if somebody wants to say, Zionism is not Judaism, right? That is a true statement. I would sign my name on that statement. But then if you zoom out and you see, okay, what exactly do they mean? Okay, well, they only have about 5% of the whole picture here. So it's a little bit more complicated. Or Zionism is an inherent part of Judaism, right? Same thing, but on the flip side, right? I agree with that statement. But again, what does it mean? How is it interacting with all these Jewish ideas? And what is now the relationship? Again, moving forward, once we are introduced to the Haskalah and Herzl, and that's going to be next week, what's the relationship with the Jewish world with this, now crazy idea to say, we're going to keep doing that thing that we've tried a bunch of times before, but this time we're not going to do it because we believe that we've calculated that the Messiah is going to come in the year 1540. We're going to do it because we think that anti-Semitism is bad enough, and this is the age of modern nation states, and Jews should have a nation state just like everybody else. So I'm going to pause here. Again, if we have another couple minutes, I said we'd end around 7:30. So if people don't have questions, happy to do one or two more slides, but I wanted to open it up for any and all questions and conversation here. Amazing. Okay, so I want to do just maybe we'll do one or two more sources, because why not? We have 15 minutes. So one, I just wanted to bring in David Hartman. David Hartman is one of the most really prolific and deep thinkers of the community in Israel in the 20th century. And Hartman says as follows, and I think he gets this exactly right. He says a couple of things about Zionism, and again, very much in keeping with this model of paradox. He writes a famous essay called Zionism as a Revolution in Self-Understanding. And he says as follows. He says, Zionism represented a transformation of this traditional form of self-understanding. Its fundamental message was, if you wish to change your exilic conditions, you must learn how nations emerge and survive. If you wish to return to your land, don't wait for a miracle or a prophet to arise. Build agricultural schools, improve your economic base and your knowledge of banking and finance. Develop the art of self-defense, of modern warfare. Become experts in military matters. In a word, master whatever it takes to build a viable state. Secular Zionism completely demythologized the Jewish people's sense of who they were. We'll get to that a little bit next week. And then he concludes and he says, Zionism has never really known itself completely, whether it is a movement of continuation and continuity or a movement of rebellion. In my opinion, it is manifestly obvious that these two trends have determined the essence of Zionism as a living thing with a dialectic of its own, and has also determined all the troubles we are confronted with today. Is Zionism a movement that seeks a continuation of what had been the Jewish tradition throughout the generations, or has it come to introduce a change into the historic phenomenon called Judaism? We all know that when we speak of Judaism, we are speaking of something that exists, but which is difficult to define. Nor is there any, in my opinion, need to define it. The question is whether we have wanted to alter fundamentally the phenomenon called Judaism or continue it. And I think this is a fascinating way to really summarize this. Hartman was writing, Gabriel just asked, in the late 20th century. So someone could probably get a more precise idea, but I'm going to guess, 1980s, 1990s. Somebody can probably fact check me within a decade or so there. But, this is far beyond after the foundation of the state of Israel. But he's really, I guess, forcing us to wrestle with a lot of these big ideas. And we'll see next week that the early Zionist thinkers very much disagreed. There were some Zionist thinkers, Herzl was one of them, by the way, whose entire mission of Zionism was a departure from Jewish tradition. He says outright. The one thing I didn't say about his book, Altneuland, which was the inspiration for Tel Aviv, is the villain in his book. It's very interesting. He writes this book about a socialist utopia. Again, he was a socialist, so a socialist utopia in the land of Israel. And the villain is a rabbi. And the rabbi is trying to bring in Jewish tradition into this secular socialist utopia and causing all sorts of trouble and skirmishes, right? The rabbi essentially is the biggest threat to the socialist utopia in Herzl's vision. And so at the end of the book, the Jews, Christians, and Muslims who are all living perfectly in this socialist utopia, again, this is what Herzl writes, end up deciding to push out the religious influences that are ruining it. Again, it's a fascinating, probably none of us would agree with his socialist politics today, but it's a fascinating glimpse of what he was trying to do, right? Herzl's goal was to have the Jewish community assimilate. For a variety of reasons, we'll discuss this next week, he ceased to believe that Jews were able to assimilate as individuals. So if assimilating as an individual is not an option, assimilate as a nation, right? Just become like every other nation state, right? If we're our own nation state, Herzl believed, no one will bother us, right? The reason for anti-Semitism, again, this is within Herzl's thought, is because Jews are the perennial minority who are always trying to do things, in a slightly different way than everyone else. So if all the Jews are living in a nation called Israel and that's off to the side, no one will bother us anymore. Great, happily. And if they do bother us, we can protect ourselves because we have an army. Again, that's Herzl in a sense. Other thinkers, certainly the religious Zionists, but even the cultural Zionists and even other people in Herzl's own camp disagreed. And they said, what are you talking about? This isn't a rejection of Judaism. We're of course, adapting and we're innovating. Jews always adapt and innovate, but come on, we have Jewish symbols, we have Jewish customs. Of course, the Israeli calendar is going to give off for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Of course, we should speak Hebrew. Of course, the national symbol of Israel should be the ancient Jewish symbol of the menorah, right? And the shield of David and all of these things that, Jewish religious tradition is sort of incorporated into the state. So it's a fascinating debate back and forth and everything there. Let's do one more slide because then we can do everything that's pre-Haskalah today, and then next week we can start with political Zionism and Herzl and the Haskalah. So I want to talk a little bit about the social conditions of that were happening alongside this debate. So really, this is pre-modern or late medieval. This is important because we'll see at the beginning of next week how much the Haskalah and the Enlightenment and also emancipation within Europe changed not just religious conditions for Jews or political conditions, but really like every part of life. Legal conditions, social conditions. I mean, there was not something in the Jewish world that stayed the same from the year 1750 to the year 1850 in Western Europe. And it's hard to see how extreme that shift was without double clicking and diving into, what might an average Jewish community, right? We started off with a thought experiment of you visiting your great-great-great-grandparent in the year 1500. So what else might you have seen if you went there? So one, this is a picture on the top right. It's a modern picture of the Jewish ghetto in Venice. Venice set up the first Jewish ghetto and in the late medieval period. And this is an area of town that Jews had to live in. And you can kind of see how it's closed off from the rest of the community. There was only one way in and one way out. Today, it's a very nice area, a great kosher restaurant. I think actually Chabad Yeshiva is there, but probably would not have been great if you were living there in the 1700s and it was just packed with people upon people. So one, Jews were socially isolated from the rest of their counterparts in Western Europe. There were very strict laws of where Jews can live. There were very strict laws of what education Jews were able to attain. There were very strict laws of everything governing really every aspect of Jews. And the idea of individualism or liberalism simply did not exist, right? Today, we have this idea of individual rights and liberalism, and also the idea that if, I do something bad, it's generally not a morally correct thing to do to blame the entire Jewish community for the actions of one person, right? We believe in individualism in this country. That idea did not exist in the pre-modern era. In the pre-modern era, Jews were a collective. They were viewed as a group that had no rights, and if something bad happened, it was the entire Jewish community's job to fix it. Jewish life was completely governed by rabbinic authority. And one of the things that, most countries, again, this is before nation states, but I'll still say countries, right? That, if you were a Jew living in Italy or Germany or France or England in the pre-modern period, yes, you were subjected to the whims of, generally the Christian government that was ruling over you. But in terms of internal, right, the Christian government doesn't want to deal with, cleaning the streets and taking out the sewers and taking out the trash. And even what happens if, I hit Rhea's car going out of the parking lot, right? They don't want to deal with that. So they say, okay, the Jewish community, you guys do it. You guys figure it out. And what is the authority in the Jewish community? It's rabbis. And so today we think of rabbis as religious guides. But in the pre-modern period, that distinction didn't exist, right? Rabbis were both what we consider today to be judges, right? Secular judges and lawyers and legal scholars, and also religious scholars, right? If you had a question about how to make your oven kosher for Passover, you went to the rabbi. And if you were getting divorced and it was a very messy situation and you were arguing about who has to, pay money for children, you went to the rabbi, right? No difference between civil and religious law. And the rabbis had the enforcement ability. They actually had the power to enforce this because they were sort of the representative of the local statespeople, the Christian statespeople. And so if somebody went against what the rabbis wanted, at times the rabbis were able to actually use, some version of a police force to do it. And at other times they also had a tactic that was far greater than physical enforcement, which was excommunication, right? If you were excommunicated, it's not as if you get to move to the next town and, restart your life as someone secular, right? If you were excommunicated in the Jewish community, right? This is what happened to Spinoza. It's not as if you get adopted by a new community and, okay, great, it's nice to have you, right? You're shunned. You have a terrible life. Spinoza had an awful life after he was excommunicated, right? Spinoza is the most famous Jew who was excommunicated in the pre-modern period, but he's not the only one. Even when there were, by the way, in the pre-modern Jewish community, there were a series of different intellectual movements. I teach a whole class at UCI about medieval Jewish philosophy, so I'm going to summarize a 10-week course in one bullet point on a slide here. There were major intellectual movements that the Jewish community went through in the medieval period. There was Maimonides, there was the Zohar, there was Kabbalah, rationalism, all these things. But any Jewish philosophy before the Haskalah assumed that Jews were staying observed to halakha, to Jewish law. This is something that obviously changes during the Haskalah, during the Jewish Enlightenment. And all around, Jews are in autonomous communities. And again, the way that they secured this was Jews would pay taxes and they were granted legal autonomy in exchange. And generally, at when times were good, again, oftentimes things got bad when, there were riots and pogroms against Jewish communities because they had no physical protection. But generally, the disposition was, okay, you want to live in Paris? Great. The Jewish community can hang out and do whatever it wants in Paris. They owe $5 million in taxes every year. Just figure it out, guys, and get back to us. So the Jewish community had to, internally figure it out. So rabbis not only were in charge of religious law and civil law, they were also, in charge of figuring out the finances of the Jewish community, and all of these things. And the most important thing, and this is what begins to maybe change during the Enlightenment, and this is going to be the entirety of our debate next week is kind of going to hinge on this point. This was pre-individualism. So Jews were not seen as individuals. Jews were seen as a collective. And Jews had no rights, right? What we consider today to be, rights under nation states did not exist, right? It's a concept that nobody would have had any idea what you're talking about if you dropped into the 1600s and started saying, well, what about basic human rights? Or, why are you blaming me for something some Jew down the street did? I'm not him. No, you're all Jews, right? And this then, next week, because this will actually be the last thing I say, becomes the big question of the Jewish community's response to the promise of emancipation. Because starting in the late 1700s with France, and then in the early 1800s with other Western European countries, Jews are beginning to be offered a choice. And that choice is, you adapt to our culture and our politics and our mores and our language, and you become one of us, you become German or become French, but that comes with an explicit, sometimes implicit, but sometimes explicit rejection of feeling like you're a part of a wider Jewish collective, right? You can change, you can attain individual rights, but that has to come at cost of feeling like you're a part of a Jewish collective. And Jews didn't know what to do, right? What do you do? Because Jews have always had this feeling of being a part of a people. And for most of history, we were treated as a people, not as individuals. And all of a sudden, when the carrot of emancipation is dangled in front of us, trade individualism for rights and reject Jewish community, what do you do? And the last thing that I'll say, right, this is from an early, and we'll start with this slide next week, but I just want to paint the question, right? A famous French jurist says, Jews should be denied everything as a nation, but granted everything as individuals. And he's writing this in the late 1700s. And this was the question that Jews begin to be dealing with starting in Western Europe when we get to modernity. So we have all this baggage of Messianism and activism and Jewish relationship to the land. And all of a sudden at the same time, or, hundreds of years later in modern Europe, we start to have, what we now know to be the end of the Enlightenment, beginning of the period of emancipation. It seems like Jews are starting to, the shtetl or the ghetto is opening depending on which country you're in. And all of a sudden, Jews begin to have this choice. How exactly do you play this? If you play your cards right, some Jews are hoping, this gets to Karen's question before, if you play your cards right, maybe we'll become equals. And maybe we'll just, be able to live the rest of eternity in Germany and France as secular Jewish Frenchmen. If we play our cards wrong, anti-Semitism is going to stay. And so how do you deal with that very real problem? Gabe, go for it.
The discussion about individualism is fascinating because it seems so relevant to today because the individualism is disappearing, right? In in these online communities, if you're, or even in real life, if you're Jewish, uh, you're bad, or if you're Israeli, you're bad. There's essentially no room for the individual anymore. Even if you're a progressive Israeli and you hate the government, you're still bad in the eyes of many nowadays. And on a related point, there was a fascinating article called "Reddit Created the First Digital Ghetto." I don't know if you saw it, but it was about how the Jewish communities on Reddit were basically begging for help from the um, corporation, from Reddit corporate, and Reddit basically said, um, we're going to recommend that you guys just stick to yourselves. Don't post in other communities. They disabled cross posting, so if you were in the Jewish subreddit or the Israel subreddit, you couldn't post to other communities, and basically said, essentially, regulate yourselves. We're not going to do it for you. And so it's a fascinating article, and sort of relevant to both of your points on individualism and the Venice ghetto.
That's super interesting. Yeah, first of all, send me that article. It sounds super interesting. I mean, my intuition is to say the Zionists were the first and only people at this time to sort of call the bluff of exactly what you're talking about. Of its early Zionist thinkers, people like Moshe Hess writing in, 1860s. This is, well beyond before Herzl, writing in Germany. And he's saying, when people are anti-Semitic, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but it's a fascinating article that Moshe Hess writes. He says when people when Jews get anti-Semitism in Germany in 1860, it's not because people don't like what we're doing, right? So it's not that people don't like the fact that I consider myself part of a nation or community of Jews. It's that people don't like my nose, and they think that my nose looks weird and it's a little bit too long. And he's writing this in 1860. This is, 70 years before Hitler rises to power. And he says, no amount of reforming of Judaism and shifting it and changing it to, look like Protestantism or look like secularism, no amount of changing is going to change Jewish noses. And he literally uses noses as an example. And so what we can tell from this time is there was sort of this tension, and this is all of next week. Everything is, I like to present history as tensions, right? Because we're always, always different ideologic groups at, battle with each other in the Jewish community. The tension next week is, can anti-Semitism be solved, right? In a short amount of words. In other words, is anti-Semitism something that, well, if we can only figure out the right mixture of religious control over the state or lack thereof, or social policies or economic policies, anti-Semitism will dissipate, right? So some Jews joined the communist parties and revolution because that was a way to do it. Other Jews went hard on capitalism because they thought, well, in capitalism and liberalism, that'll do it. Others advocated for, full separation of church and state, liberalism, right? That'll do it. And the Zionists said, well, maybe we'll believe it if we see it, but we don't actually think that these are problems that can be solved. They can be dealt with, right? A way of dealing with it is by saying, you guys figure out whatever you have to in Europe. We're going to go kind of do our own thing and make sure we have protection until you figure out how to keep us safe. But we're not going to sit here and wait around for you guys to figure that out. And this was sort of the Zionists, right? It's why, again, in 1890, Zionism was a tiny fringe movement in the Jewish community. By 1925, almost all Jews were Zionists. And by 1945, the entire Jewish world. I mean, I'm sure there were some holdouts, and, over some of the most ultra-Orthodox groups, there were holdouts, but there was almost no one in the Jewish community who were not Zionists by 1945. And that's true until, I don't know, what, a year ago, 2 years ago, whatever. We can talk about that after class, but that was a consensus, right? The Zionists were vindicated. And so to Karen's point before, I just want to address it again of saying, well, people always bring up, like, there were principled anti-Zionists in the Jewish community. And listen, if I was in the year 1900 and I was living in Berlin, I don't know, I hope I would be prescient enough to say, the Zionists are right, and the people that are saying we got to stay here because things are progressing and we just got to try a little harder. I'm hoping I would see past that, but, like, it's not obvious. And so then to say, well, Jews were anti-Zionist then, so anti-Zionism now is a totally legitimate position, it's just talking about two completely different things. Like, it's not, it's why there's actually a move. Adam Lewis Klein, who Karen mentioned before, actually does this, and there's a whole new school of thought run by David Hirschberg, or Hirsch, who studies the study for contemporary anti-Semitism. He's a professor in England, and he started making a distinction between anti-Zionism with a hyphen and anti-Zionism without a hyphen. And I think this is important, right? You think, who cares about a hyphen? But for him, anti-Zionism with a hyphen is a normative view that, we can talk about as an ideology and historically. But anti-Zionism, one word, all lowercase without a hyphen, is just a hate movement and has nothing to do with the principled anti-Zionism with a hyphen. I'll maybe send out an article on that because I think it's a very interesting distinction. Rhea, go for it.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because we're talking about our community, what a community. And I forgot the person's name who was just talking to you. And he mentioned an online community, which is totally different. It's a totally different thing. There's something better than using the word thing, but the the anti-Judaism, the vicious anti-Semitism that has existed all through the ages, and where physically Jews were killed, forced to live in ghettos, seen as Christ killers, the viciousness of something like that. And now it's the ideology of communism, which was considered, Karl Marx was an anti-Semite who had come from Jewish stock. So it's a really complicated picture. And added to it now is the online aspect to it, where you don't even see who you're discussing with, who you're talking to. And I don't know if you've thought about these different modes of communities and the different modes of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, and if you wanted to say anti-Zionism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the big question. I mean, anyone that's under 40 is chronically online. I mean, I can tell you from students, I mean, that's when they're receiving, the majority of interactions are happening online. And so it's a big, no one really knows how to deal with this problem. And I think, there is this whole center now for the, critical study of modern anti-Semitism that I think is trying to address this in very interesting ways. But, for a long time, we've kind of been asleep at the wheel when it comes to these questions because because of all the tensions that I talked about today and we will talk about next week, it's a complicated enough picture that it's been very difficult for the Jewish community to clearly explain where exactly to differentiate between anti-Zionism with a hyphen, anti-Zionism without a hyphen, principled criticism of Israel to anti-Semitism, and even how to address the question of like, hey, in 1920, lots of Jews were against Zionism, how can it be anti-Semitism to do it today? And, there's just so many layers of this and just, you need to know so much to even begin to address these questions. And the anti-Zionist movements are sort of moving, they're moving so fast. I mean, they're taking from Soviet anti-Semitism, and before that, they're taking from Nazi anti-Semitism, and they're taking from, Protocols of Elders of Zion anti-Semitism, and they're just, kind of mixing it up in a blender, and then they're saying, well, this is also anti-Zionism the same way that Avraham Geiger was an anti-Zionist in the 1800s, the founder of Jewish Reform movement. And these two things aren't the same thing at all. I mean, they happen to have the same words, but, it's almost, the most obvious difference is that I always say to students, I think, it's a little bit oversimplistic, but it works, is it's very reasonable for a couple to debate about whether or not they want to have a child. It's another thing when the child's 3 years old for them to debate, should they still keep that child, right? Like, those are two different things. You wouldn't, if someone doesn't want to have children, that's fine. That's a moral, or personal question. Great. But deciding you want to get rid of your 3-year-old, that's a whole other set of moral considerations. And you can say, well, what do you mean? 4 years ago, I wasn't sure. And you said, oh, I don't know. It's a tough decision, Okay, well, things change. And, it's one thing to be against something before it exists and another thing after. And so that's one way to understand the distinction. But it is a very interesting question, I think, from the theoretic perspective of the Jewish community. So anyway, I know it's past 7:30. I'm more than happy to stay and chat afterwards. But thank you, everybody. And I will
Thank
send
you.
out.
Good class, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you.
That's
I'll send
really
out both
good.
the recording and also just some material if people want to peruse it before next week, Thursday. And I'll send a reminder at some point next Thursday morning. But thank you again, everyone. And thank you for,
Thank you.
supporting Hillel and everything.
Thank you so much,